Earth is a better game than Wingspan. At least that's the opinion I'm trying to explore today. You could find that opinion plastered all over the internet. In fact, the designer himself has gone to BGG and in a post makes the case why Earth is better than many like games in the genre, including probably its closest cousin in Wingspan. I will say one very important note is Wingspan came out in 2019. We are just getting our hands on Earth right now. And the designer, Maxime Tardif, has stated that he loves Wingspan and has played it over 130 times. So I think it's probably safe to say there is a pretty close relation to Wingspan and Earth. At least that's what I think you'll see once I break down some of these mechanics and we walk through what Earth has done to improve or not on what Wingspan has already built. So we're going to talk about Earth and its similarities and differences to Wingspan under a few different categories. They both are tableau builders, so we're going to talk about the tableau and how that differs. They both have action selection connected to the building of an engine, so we're going to compare and contrast that. We're going to also talk about those core cards and the differences between the two games. And in the end, I'm going to make the ultimate judgment call and let you know, in my opinion at least, if Earth is greater than Wingspan. I think it might be helpful to give you a quick 60-second overview on what Wingspan is to set the stage and the context for my assessment of Earth. Wingspan is a tableau building, engine building game. You select actions. Those actions allow you to get food from the feeder, lay eggs on birds, or draw cards, the power of which increases depending on how many cards you've already played in that particular row. That's also important because at that time you can activate all birds in that same row that have a brown ability. So every time you're choosing an action that is not playing one of these bird cards, you're activating an engine. Wingspan is played over a number of rounds. You have a finite number of turns, and those turns start to become less and less as you go from round to round. You score points through laying eggs on cards or tucking cards behind birds. There's also inherent points on each bird card that you've played. And there's intra-round goals that are kind of community and shared goals. And then you also have personal endgame goals. Add up the points at the end of the game. The one who has the most wins. So now that we have Wingspan out of the way, we have the context built. This is the base in which I'm building my assessment of Earth on top of. Let's talk a little bit about what Earth does. Very much like Wingspan, you are building a tableau of cards that will eventually act as an engine, and that engine is triggered based upon the actions you're selecting. Sound familiar? That's because it is. I mean, it's absolutely, in my opinion at least, standing on the shoulders of what Wingspan has built. It's kind of Wingspan on steroids because while there are a lot of mechanisms that are really similar, I think the designer has taken it to the next level and added more. So while you are building a tableau in both games, Earth certainly does it in a more complex manner, giving more agency and options to the player. There's no real restrictions as to where you're playing a card. It's a 4x4 grid. You can play the card wherever you want. The only restriction is it has to be either orthogonally adjacent or diagonally adjacent to a previously played card. And adjacency doesn't only matter on the placement, it matters on scoring. Take this card, the Meadow, for example. You score 5 points per 3-leafy type card diagonally adjacent to this card. So diagonally makes it a little more tricky, and this card is a really great example of needing to see this fairly early on in the game to really maximize its placement on a 4x4 grid. Another note about the tableau is when your engine is activated, and we'll get to how that happens in just a second, it's important to note that it activates left to right, top to bottom. So the order in which you're placing those cards absolutely matters, similarly to Wingspan. In an engine builder where you are producing a good and then having to trade that good for more goods, better goods, points, whatever it may be, order is important. So let's talk a little bit about action selection. There are 4 actions: planting, composting, watering, and growing. Each one of these actions come with an initial benefit or action to take, and then they run a certain part of your engine based upon the color associated with that action. Take planting, for example. You can plant 2 cards into your tableau and draw 4 and keep 1. At the same time, any card that's color-coded green will activate at that time. With the composting action, you get 5 soil. Soil is important because it's the only currency used to play cards into your tableau. You're also able to take cards from the draw pile and put them in your compost pile. Compost pile is probably most directly related to the idea of tucking cards behind birds. There's different actions that allow you to put cards into that pile, either from your hand or the draw pile. Most often it is your hand, but those are points in the end game. And what Earth does a little bit different is it allows those to be used, and they must be used, frankly, in your engine as resources to get other things. That's a common theme, is that everything is a resource, which we'll come back to. Next up, watering. There's a concept that is also related to Wingspan in my mind, which is this concept of sprouts. There's these little green cubes here that you place on cards. There's spaces on those cards that takes a finite number of these cubes. Sounds a lot like laying eggs in Wingspan, and those score you 1 point at the end of the game per cube. Similar to Wingspan, they're also used as a resource. In addition to the sprout cubes, you also gain 2 soil. And last but not least is growing. It's this yellow action. You gain 4 cards and you also grow on cards. So back to the theme of adding more or expanding upon the original ideas of Wingspan, Maxime Tardif does that here with this idea of growth. So cards can have these sprout spaces. Most of them also have a space for growth, and that's where you get these vertical trees. Each card can have a certain number of these pieces on, and the very last one is a little tree topper. If you complete the tree or complete the growth, you get bonus points. So if it's uncompleted, each piece is a point. There's a variable number of points or bonus you get if you complete the full growth on the card. One other feature or differentiation from Wingspan, much like Ares Expedition, when you select an action, the other player gets a less powerful version of that action. There's simultaneous actions that are slightly different every single turn, so a player is always doing something. And on top of that, depending on the action chosen, everybody gets to activate that color throughout their entire tableau. So any card that matches that color, or in 3 of the action choices, there's these multicolor cards, which are pretty rare. So no matter who is going, you're always taking an action and also activating a particular portion of your engine. This makes for a breakneck pace out of the gates. I certainly wouldn't say I ever got bored in this game. I felt like my mind was always going. There was always an action to take, and there's always an engine to run. And especially a little bit later in the game, when you start to fill up half or more of your tableau with cards, there's a lot of things to do. And back to the theme of more, the designer certainly has accomplished that here. You are constantly getting stuff. You're constantly exchanging stuff. You just get more stuff, more and more stuff. That's kind of the big difference in my mind, is this idea of constant motion and constant action. The question is, does it add to the game for me or detract? I'm going to cite a portion of Maxime's post on BGG. He essentially says that Earth creates a maximum or superior amount of dopamine because you're constantly getting goods and constantly doing stuff and getting stuff and being rewarded. And when I read that, I didn't know what to make of it. And I started playing the game more and more, and I honestly wasn't getting that feeling. I couldn't quite put my finger on it because inherently I did think like more is better. I keep getting more and more things. There's activating all of these cards. I'm trading in all of these goods and getting more goods and playing more cards, but it felt a little empty. And then I remembered, actually, well, first, let me preface by saying I'm not a doctor nor a scientist, so don't take this verbatim, but I'm going to link an article in the description in Psychology Today, and I've heard this in multiple places about dopamine. Dopamine isn't something that just comes when you're rewarded. It actually is at its highest point, according to studies, prior to the reward. So the anticipation actually feels better than getting the reward. So if we look at this from a practical example, think about your favorite food. In my case, it's probably pizza. I love pizza. Let's imagine I'm eating pizza every day for dinner. I could probably do it. It's not that bad. But then let's think about having it every meal. Then let's think about having it every meal and snacks in between. Then let's think about having it about 50 times in a 45-minute period. I would guess that the idea of pizza wouldn't be as appealing after getting it over and over and over again. And that's what I think this simultaneous action, and it's not just the action, because I really like the way that Ares Expedition implements it, but I think running your engine on every single turn makes it feel less special, less precious. And I'm never left in anticipation of a reward. Frankly, if everything's a reward, nothing is a reward. And that's kind of what it feels like here to me. Also, strategically, I don't feel like I have time to breathe, to really think about the puzzle I'm trying to solve, look through my hand of cards, make strategic decisions, watch those decisions work or not. And when they do work, have this flood of reward that comes in because of the actions I took, making me feel smart. This game doesn't make me feel smart. I feel like I am kind of stumbling into an engine, and it's giving me so much so often. This idea of scarcity is hardly ever felt. And I will say, for really high level thinkers, which I am not one, you could probably see a really clear strategy with a ton of cards in hand, constantly activating an engine, and think a couple turns ahead. But there's so much to do on everyone's turn, so many cards in hand, that it was hard for me to really think strategically and feel smart. Wingspan, on the other hand, really runs that engine a finite number of times. It's a game that I can look at my hand of cards, look at the market, and start to craft a strategy that I think might work and build anticipation for when I finally start to run the engine that I've built, to see it start to produce the thing in which I had envisioned. So those passes at running that engine feel more precious. They feel special, if that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about cards. So with Earth, there are event cards. They're essentially one-time action usage. They don't get played in your tableau at all. Some are big, some have big rewards and big costs, and others have small rewards and small costs. I would say there's nothing particularly noteworthy in those cards. They're fine. But while there's nothing noteworthy, I think they are powerful cards, and when you have one in your hand, you should probably try to use it. All right, so terrain cards. These are cards you actually play in your tableau, take up space. They do a couple different things, and I did some math here. So 12% of the cards deal with a pretty large immediate bonus. If you find these in your hand, you should probably try to play them. The scarcity and rarity of that card would probably signal it would be good to play. 18% are discount cards. These cards give you discounts on certain card types, playing into your tableau. That is very important and very powerful in the beginning of the game, but by the end of the game, that cost reward kind of ratio starts to wane a bit. 27% are enhancements to your green action. There are very few cards in the game that actually augment the green action or the planting action, where you actually play cards into your tableau. And 42% of those cards, the vast majority of these, deal with giving you points based upon adjacency to other cards. Think of them as tableau goals. It's one of the reasons why adjacency and the way in which you build that tableau is important. And the most prevalent card type that you're going to be drawing are flora cards. In relation to Wingspan, they are the thing that represents probably a bird card. All of these flora cards have inherent point values on them that as you play them, you'll be able to score at the end of the game. They come in a variety of colors. Those colors are connected to actions, as we previously mentioned. That engine or those cards will activate when that action is selected by anybody. And I might be missing a few things here, but there are three main things I found these cards do. They either straight up give you a good, so a sprout, growth, soil, cards, allow you to place cards into the compost pile, or they allow you to trade in fewer of one good for more of another. It's a trade-up mechanism. And lastly, there's a category of card that when activated will allow you to place things like growth or sprouts on adjacent cards based upon a condition. And that's really it. This all revolves around this idea that everything's a point and everything's a resource. Cards are resources, sprouts are resources, are resources, soil is resources, and it's kind of like this big trading engine. So how that relates to Wingspan, clearly Wingspan has plenty of cards that are play for a single immediate action or get goods, trade up goods. Pretty basic, straightforward things. But then it has a class of card that becomes much more interesting in my mind. I mean, take the Great Horned Owl, for example. And when we look at this, keep in mind that idea of dopamine being greatest in the moments of anticipation. When this card activates, you draw a card. If that card is within a particular parameter on wingspan or wing length, then you get to tuck that card behind the Great Horned Owl, insinuating that it just ate that bird. I mean, how cool and thematic is that? And also think about, as you draw the card, you don't know if that's going to equate into a point. You have anticipation as it's drawn, you take a look at it, and you either win or lose. And when you win, it feels good. There's a little mental fist pump in there. Or how about the Oriole, where you get food, but the trade-off is the other players get food as well. So that creates a really interesting decision when that card's in hand, where you would really like to continue to get berries constantly as you activate your engine, but can you afford to give those berries to another player? I will admit it's probably my least favorite card to actually play, but it at least creates an interesting decision whether you play it or not. In Earth, I have a hard time deciding what not to play because it all feels the same. A card class that I like a little bit better is something like the Eastern Kingbird, where I get food when the other player plays a certain type of bird. This idea of getting something because somebody else accomplished something is used all throughout Earth. In fact, it's used every turn ad nauseum. In Wingspan, it makes you earn that ability by playing a card. Then there's the broken cards, and that's definitely, for some, or at least has been widely reported as a negative about this game, which is there's just broken cards and broken combinations. Between Franklin's Goal, Killdeer, and the Ravens, there have been some pretty devastating combos found where if you have one of these birds, there's a very good chance, if you use it correctly, that you're going to win the game. In Earth's defense, the designer has done everything he can to balance this game. In fact, has used formula and mathematics to almost perfectly balance it. And with that goal in mind, I think he has absolutely succeeded. Every card feels balanced. Every card feels kind of the same. In Wingspan, there are broken cards. There's cards that are really weak that I'll probably never play unless I have to. And then there's cards I get really excited about when they hit my hand. And that imbalance, to me, gets me excited. I play board games to escape. And that escape comes with this idea of power fantasy. It's one in which makes a lot of games fun for me. It's this idea of starting with nothing, and then through my sheer wit and luck, I am able to craft something that makes me feel so much more powerful by the end of the game. And if I do it in a way that's better than another player, or maybe have a little luck to get there, I will come out as victorious. I don't get that with Earth. And while it's looked upon as a flaw in Wingspan, I kind of like its flaws. And now that leads me to my final thoughts here. In my mind, Earth is a game that is standing on the shoulders of Wingspan, like many games do. And that's kind of how we keep getting games to market. We take ideas and expand upon them. And I think Earth has absolutely done that. The designer clearly had a love for engine building, tableau building, action selection, and there are similarities to a bunch of different games. But Wingspan in particular feels like the closest relative. And in almost every aspect, the designer has given us more. And with the core goal of creating more fun, which I think is what every designer is trying to do when they kind of build upon a previous design or mechanic, I think the premise that more equals more fun, more actions, more resources, more activity, constantly going, fast paced. I think if you assume that that equals fun, Earth for you might be more fun. But for me, while it feels like a really elegant design, really nicely balanced, it just fell short in the fun department for me. I don't get the anticipation that I get in Wingspan. I think the scarcity and the number of times that you're running your engine helps that activity feel much more special. The subsequent building of that engine feel much more rewarding, and I feel like I've accomplished it more rather than the game kind of automatically doing it for me. And the cards, I just think the cards are more interesting than Wingspan, bottom line. I imagine Earth will get an expansion and they'll start to add more and more interesting cards, but I don't know that that is a solution to my problem, just because of the pace of the game, the number of cards you see, all the stuff you're doing. I don't know that I'd have enough time to appreciate it. With Wingspan, I have time to sit back, relax, think about and craft a strategy, execute it, and watch it either fail or succeed. And I have to say, I'm biased. Wingspan was my very first true entry into modern board gaming. Like so many of us that have come into the hobby in the last few years, it just holds a special place in my heart. So call this biased. It might be, honestly. I mean, everything's biased if you really think about it. But I love Wingspan. I don't play it all the time anymore. I feel like I've kind of graduated there. But when I come across new people in the hobby, inevitably I recommend and or introduce them personally to Wingspan. And every recommendation has actually been a winner for me. I haven't met somebody that really hated Wingspan. I'm sure you all are out there. And on that note, if you are, let me know in the comments, because I know this is probably a controversial opinion. Earth is beloved. It's the newest iteration of engine tableau building, and a lot of you really love this game. And I'm not saying you're wrong. It's just not the game for me. That's all. And if you made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking with me. If I've added any sort of value for you, maybe like and subscribe. I don't know. Either way, have a great day. I'm out.